Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, host of Life Along the Merrimack. It's a podcast for a half hour each week, and we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. Here you see the river. It's one of its glorious photos. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today is getting the river cleaner. And we're going to be talking a little about how it happened and how the Clean Water Act of 1972, which was pioneered by Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine, really helped the river quite a bit. But here is, just a fabulous photo. To the right, you can see Salisbury. And this is camping season, and there are about 484 camping spots over in Salisbury at the state park. It's compromised right now. It's not full, but that's a tremendous asset when times are good. To the left, you see Plum Island. There's a little red top building out there that used to be the old Coast Guard station. Now it's used by the Coast Guard Auxiliary. And of course, you see the two jetties, south and north. They were reworked about 5 years ago. About $10 million went into each jetty. And the motive was navigation. They wanted to make sure that it didn't get full of sand and get even shallower than it is. But, it's a beautiful harbor, as you can see. Off to the right is the marsh. This is the largest marsh in New England, and it's 25,000 square acres, and, just a tremendous boon for wildlife, for fish, for just keeping the whole estuary area alive. When we think about the Merrimack River, it starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. As you can see, it's about 117 miles long. It comes straight down to Lowell, where you see the number 3 there, and kind of goes to the northeast. It's one of the largest rivers in New England. It's certainly one of the most historic. And here you can see how it actually starts and heads to the ocean where we are. Newburyport was a leading shipbuilding community in the 18th century and part of the 19th. And here is a painting by Richard Burke Jones of Newburyport. He's also the city clerk in Newburyport, very versatile guy. And you can just see how much commerce there was here, how large the ships are. It built hundreds of ships per year and was actually a busier shipbuilding area than at one time than Boston or Salem or Portsmouth. And one reason why that is because the Merrimack River, as discussed, went about 117 miles into New Hampshire, and they could float timber down. So there was a great source of wood here in Newburyport, which other communities did not have. It was also a community that took a great interest in it. It was almost full employment if you think about it. But look how large this vessel is. This is from 1893. It was a Symington. To the left, you can see some wonderful slides of what it looked like when it was being built. And you can see how, first of all, how many people came out for its launch, how large it was. You can see that how small the people look. And in the foreground, there are women and children who came down. School was frequently put off for the day. Shops were closed. And it was a wonderful event when a ship was put to sea. When we talk about the Merrimack River, a big element of its history is hydropower that moved the textile industry. This is Pawtucket Falls in Lowell. It had one of the largest drops in the Northeast, and the mills began being built there in the 1820s. It created great hydropower, but it changed the nature of the river. Henry David Thoreau took offense, as the slide indicates. He came up in a canoe with his brother, and in 1839, this is going way back, it's only 20 years into textile work. He said, this is going to ruin the river. The fish won't be able to get upriver. It's going to get polluted, and it's not a good thing for the natural world. He was correct, of course, but from the 1820s, when Lowell started, Shortly thereafter, Lawrence was built, and Lawrence was built for this specific purpose. First, they put the mills in and then made the hydropower work, and then they built tenements and dorms, and they started encouraging workers to come there. So the mills had a very big effect on the Merrimack River. This is what part of Lawrence looked like in the late 19th century. You can see many smokestacks of the mills. It was a highly pollutant business. There was very little waste control. The waste went into the river, and that includes the dyes for textiles. So if you were doing, green cloth that day, the river might look green or might look orange. By our standards, it was a terrible thing. But there you can see the railroad on the right. Hard cloth or raw cotton came up from the south. It was put into the mills, and then it would go back out as cloth, sometimes to England, sometimes around the world. But this was an example of what it looked like in the old days. One of the great things about the mill life was the clocks that they sometimes had. This was in Lawrence, one of the largest in the world a century ago, and that clock is still there today. Most of us have watches now, but in those days, a lot of mill workers could not afford or did not wear watches. But if you were anywhere in town, you could look at the clock and get a sense, when does my shift start? How am I going to plan my day? And so this was a public clock, and it's still there today. It's one of the largest in the world, even now. Manchester, New Hampshire is another community that was a significant textile maker a century or two ago. The Amesquig Manufacturing Company was one of the largest in the world. And this is an unusual photo, unusually good in my opinion. I'm a journalist, and this is a very vibrant photo. The flood of 1936 hit much of New England. It hit the Merrimack, it hit the Kennebec in Maine, the Androscoggin in Maine. Many different rivers were just totally flooded. And here you can see how much damage and how high it was. Those buildings are still there in Manchester. I go upriver once or twice a week to take photos because I'm writing a book. And the book is going to be titled Merrimack, the Resilient River. Part of the reason I call it resilient is because it's made many comebacks. And this is a comeback of sorts. A great flood. It subsided, of course. Manchester put itself together. But this is an example of how bad things could be in terms of weather. And here is another shot of where the Merrimack meets the sea. It's a beautiful area, as you know, if you're from here. But it has always had a sandbar. And I think you can see that to the lower left of this image. And it has been a real problem for ship captains for many, many years. And newcomers, pleasure boats come in, and unless they call ahead and find out about the sandbar, they frequently, will ride up on the sandbar, especially at low tide. So when you hear people talk about a shallow river, it's about 16 feet at its depth at low tide, but at high tide it's more, but this looks like low tide, and you have to stay to the north side. The Merrimack is a fine place to keep a boat. We do talk about pollution. We do talk about the fact that over the years, there has been much difficulty in keeping the river clean. But nevertheless, it's a gorgeous river, even now. This is taken over in Amesbury. In the background is part of Maudsley State Park. And people who have gone down the river say, there's so much beauty about the river. There's still a lot of wildlife. And I think that's why a lot of people want to keep working to keep it clean. There's a group now called the Merrimack River Commission that meets regularly. There are about 120 people on it, maybe 30 or 40 on the steering committee. But everyone is trying to figure out a way, how can we make the sewage treatment plants more effective? How can we keep deadly chemicals out of the water? How can we limit building and construction and development in areas mostly in southern New Hampshire that are taking away the woods and taking away the fields and putting in shopping centers and buildings. But I think you can see here, what a beautiful spot the Merrimack can be. Here's another shot showing Maudsley State Park. This is near Hatter's Point. Hatter's Point is in Amesbury. It used to be a hat factory. They've done a great job in converting it to condominiums. For years, it didn't seem like anything was going to happen. But now it's quite handsome. And this is very close to Hatter's Point. You can keep a boat there, and it's a beautiful part of the river to go into. There's been more information about the Merrimack in recent years. The National Park Service in Lowell runs vessels out of their national park right on the river. And if you haven't been to this national park on the river in Lowell, you should perhaps go to it. It not only talks about the river, but it also goes through how the mill worked, who worked in the mill in the old days. First, there were Yankee farm girls, as they were called. Then there were so many mills in Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, that many immigrants came to this area, and French Canadians and Italians and Jews from Europe and Portuguese and Albanians and Irish. They needed people to fill the mills. And so the Park Service gives a good tour much throughout the summer. And if it's different now, of course, I think the virus makes everything different. But this is what it looks like on a good day when health is broken out. The Merrimack starts in Franklin, New Hampshire, and here's some fast water near the start of the waterway. Last August, as I mentioned, about 24 people started kayaking from Franklin, New Hampshire, and this is some of the early water that they would have faced. Now, I quickly point out they had to do a lot of portaging. And portaging is where there's a falls or there's some canal work, and you have to pick the kayak up and walk around for a while. And this was an example of, you can go from here to, Lowell is beautiful, much of it free and open, just like this. But when you get to Lowell, you've got to start portaging. And of course, when you get to Manchester, which is a little before that, you will have portaged also. Here is the Merrimack River in Manchester, New Hampshire, and you can see why portaging might be in order. It would be the rare kayaker who wanted to go over this. And, in addition, the fact that it's blocked off by those the entrapments on top of the dam, there is a little portage area right in this area. So I've been there. I took this picture, as a matter of fact. Behind the falls, you can see a lot of electrical works. They still use hydropower to generate electricity in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts. And sometimes we overlook that the river is still provides electrical power to thousands of homes in the Merrimack Valley. And it also provides drinking water to hundreds of thousands of homes. Lawrence, Andover, Chelmsford, those are some of the communities that get drinking water. It is, of course, purified, and there's a good science to that. And one of the interesting stories about the Merrimack River is the science of making the water drinkable. In the 1890s, a number of youngsters in Lawrence got typhoid fever. And it wasn't clear why, but these were poor families. They got their drinking water right from the river. The wealthier families lived distant from the river, and they had their own wells. But some of the mill families had drinking water, which did go through a purification process, but it was not that effective. So the State Commission in 1890 put together, the state state officials put together a water commission in about 1890. And this was the case where several professors in the East and from MIT studied the Lawrence water situation and came up with a more effective way to clean the water for drinking. So that was a great success. It saved lives in Lawrence and elsewhere, and it was replicated throughout the country. So when we think about the Merrimack, what happened here, some of the big themes are shipbuilding. It was the birthplace of the Coast Guard. It was the birthplace of the textile industry. It was the birthplace of the science that brought us good, clean water. And it was the birthplace of the labor movement, because in 1914, a lot of the workers in Lawrence had a pay cut, they had more hours, they made a job action, and were actually had one of the most successful labor strikes of that era. They got their money back and hours were cut. I should point out, it was a tough strike. State police were brought in and there was hard times. Some of the families sent their kids to the countryside or to relatives in other cities because they didn't have enough food. There was violence. But this was a success story for Lawrence, the Bread and Roses strike of 1914. Here is a picture of Lowell, Massachusetts, and the Merrimack going through part of the campus at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. At the right is a dormitory. So this looks like a low tide moment, but you can also see the complexity of dams and bridges and so many things have to go into place to make it work. But for decades, there was work being done in the Merrimack River. But I think a lot of people would say that Merrimack and the University of Maine, Mass Lowell, have been together. The university has improved tremendously in the 50 or 60 past years. They've utilized the river. They've made a beautiful campus. And here's one example of, a good looking part of Lowell. This is another aspect of Lowell right here. They have what they call a canyon walk. And you can get a brochure and you can walk around much of Lowell and find out where different mills were. But, it's remarkable how many people worked here, how many people raised families here. There were many immigrants. And once again, it wasn't until relatively recently that people took clean water seriously. It's hard to believe, but the first Clean Water Act was introduced in 1947. In my view, that's kind of late. I mean, until almost 1947, you had industry and sewage treatment plants were just discharging. Fish disappeared, people got sick. And so later, the 1947 bill was set up to save wildlife, but that led to 1972, the Clean Water Act, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I think the reason I named my next book, Merrimack, the Resilient River, it's been through a lot. And so this is an example of an urban canyon of a river, but it's one of many canals in Lowell. Here's another picture of Manchester. Lowell has improved a good deal in the last 2 decades, and in part because of good legislators, including Senator Paul Tsongas. Manchester has really come on strong in recent years. All the much of the mills, and you see them to your right here, have been converted to businesses. Oracle Software is there. University of Southern New Hampshire is there. And it's just filled up. It's tremendously vibrant. It's the key city of Manchester, of New Hampshire, but you can see it's looking good. It's melding the old mills on the right. It has some modern structures on the left, and things have improved in that part of New Hampshire. We were talking about the kayakers who last August traveled down from Franklin, New Hampshire to Newburyport. And here's what it looks like. That's some white water, I've got to tell you. And I talked to just about everybody. I think there were 11 people who made the whole trip. In other words, they, 3 nights sleeping out on the beach or in dorms somewhere. But there were about 24 who had some part of it. Here is Jim Kelcourse. He's state representative from the district that represents Newburyport, Amesbury, and Salisbury. He's in the foreground. And he, as I hear it, was, the first one up in the morning. He's very, he's a competitive guy. He's a big guy. He's about 6'3", weighs about 260. He played football for Villanova. So he is a competitive guy. And here he is leading some other kayakers through some white water. And it's a pretty exciting trip for everybody who went. The last stop for them was, of course, Newburyport. And here's a wonderful rendering of what it can look like in the summer. It's a shallow harbor, but because the river got cleaner, and starting after 1972, pleasure boats came back. Right now, there are more than 1,500 pleasure boats registered on the Merrimack, Newburyport, Salisbury, Amesbury, Haverhill. I mean, that is a lot. So this is an example of what the river looks like toward the end of the day and how many vessels have come here. One of the industries that has not progressed is commercial fishing. 150 years ago, there were scores of fishing boats out of Newburyport. Many things changed, of course. Partly fish disappeared, partly because federal guidelines have changed significantly. And if you want to get a local commercial fisherman completely annoyed, start talking about NOAA regulations. In other words, federal regulations on how many fish people can catch. So we have about 6 or 8 vessels now in Newburyport Harbor. They keep going out. I hope they do well. But it's one of the industries that has diminished in recent years. Now, one of the great themes of the modern era, and I consider the modern era of the Merrimack River, starting in 1972. Senator Muskie was from Maine. He sponsored the Clean Water Act of 72. As we have talked about, there was very little in the way of environmental legislation. But this was a multi-billion-dollar bill that gave money to, say, the Merrimack, cities along the Merrimack River, to build sewage treatment plants. It mandated them. Now, one of the problems of the plants is they merged rain runoff with sewage, but still, there was a huge improvement after 1972 when the money started coming in, not just for the Merrimack, of course, but for Maine, Connecticut, many rivers in this country. And it was a thing, and if you talk to old timers here in town, they didn't go near the river when they were youngsters. They were, if they fell in, they were supposed to go home and take a shower. In fact, Charlie Tantar, who was a city councilor here in Newburyport, was doing a crew event on the Merrimack. I think it was 1971. He fell into the Merrimack and it took him to the emergency department in Lowell because they were so concerned. Well, the river is greatly polluted. We like Charlie Tantar. I think he went to George Washington or Georgetown. They came up here for a big rowing regatta, but he fell into the river and was rushed off to the local hospital. Ed Muskie was a national figure in 1968. He ran for vice president. And I remember I was a reporter in Portland, Maine, and when he was running for office, I think it was 76, I went out with him. He's running for Senate again. And we went to the most polluted shop that I've ever been in. There was a sled factory. There was a lot of paint. There was a lot of paint thinner. If someone had lit a cigarette, and people smoked in those days, we all would have been blown up. It was terrible. I thought Muskie might, shake his fist and said, you've got to clean up this plant. People are in danger. But he was a man of his day, a politician. shook some hands. Everyone appreciated him being there. And then we went to the next stop. But he was a very effective person. He was tenacious advocate. It took an enormous amount of work to get the Clean Water Act through in 1972. His wife, Jane, is in the background right over his shoulder to the left in this photo. And he was a hard worker. He might be remembered for his vice presidential run. He was also Secretary of State during the Iranian crisis, which was about the hardest job you could have at that time. But he will be remembered for his great work on the Clean Water Act. And actually, it did pass the House, it passed the Senate. President Nixon vetoed it, but Congress overrode a veto. And so this was a great step forward. And I think most people who have studied the river and its health will say the Clean Water Act was really, really important. Another real asset to this area was Senator Paul Tsongas. He grew up in Lowell, and he was a champion of the Merrimack River. People who know him say that just about everything good that happened to Lowell in a period of time was because of Paul Tsongas. He was a champion. He was very effective. He served first in Congress and then as a senator. He himself did run for president also, didn't get too far. He lived from 1941 to 1997. He died far too early at age 55, but he was a great asset to this community and to the river. Here's Paul Tsongas with his wife, Nikki, and his girls. Nikki Tsongas went on to become a congresswoman herself from about 2007 to about 2019. And so she has also been a great advocate for the river. And they say it takes a village, and there are many villages working right now for Clean Merrimack. Here is the gravesite of Paul Tsongas, 1997. It's very tranquil, it's very beautiful. And he was a hard worker for the river and really made it a better place. So that's about it for Life Along the Merrimack. We come together Tuesdays at 2:00. We talk about the health and the history of the Merrimack River. We'll be back again next week. Each time I try to expand the number of slides and the number of themes to talk about. But I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you for being with us.